We're going to start today talking about policy regimes with a talk really on the role of policy when we look at greenhouse gas savings. I work at a climate change research centre, so our main interest in life is greenhouse gases. If we are looking at energy systems, then we're doing it because we're interested in the greenhouse gas performance. Now, bioenergy is complicated. There are lots of other benefits as well, but for this start this morning, we're thinking about the greenhouse gas side of it. If you're a student in economics or in the policy side of things, this is what you generally get told, that we've got a fossil fuel-based economy, and we have therefore an energy system that delivers private benefits to people who can afford it. And the problem with that system is that the external costs get levied on everyone else, and the environment and the wider society have to pay those external costs in an often invisible way. The job of energy policy, supposedly, is to change commercial behaviour in order to reduce, or preferably eliminate, those external costs. So it's to sort of create a level playing field, and we're really thinking here that fossil fuel-based energy provision in particular contributes to climate change. Climate change impacts upon everyone on the planet ultimately. And if we want to minimise that, then the job of energy policy is to intervene in order to make these things more equitable and to share out the cost associated with that fossil fuel usage across the whole of society. So that's the sort of guiding principle of why we're bothering trying to fiddle with the prices and to make things happen from an energy policy perspective. Now, I said bioenergy is complicated. And with bioenergy, if we want to make bioenergy happen, a lot of that is actually about mobilising resource. Because if you don't have the biomass to start with and that doesn't come in at a cost-effective price, then you can't deliver the energy at the far end. When we look at many of the issues associated with bioenergy from a wider sustainability perspective, you get a framing that looks a little bit like this. So if I'm interested in the whole resource out there, you get lots of studies that tell you that you can, heat the whole planet and do everything you ever wanted with bioenergy because they look at the theoretical potential. We then need to downscale that a bit and say, well, actually, a lot of that isn't accessible, and look at the technical potential. Within that, you have a number of other different categories you can put in, and you get down to what's actually practical and sensible people would countenance. And in the middle here, I've put that we eventually get down to what's an economic potential. So in the market today, I'll have a certain amount that's practical, and from my definition, practical includes sustainable. So I've got sustainable stuff in there, and I've got stuff that would make sense in the market today. You have an overlap in the middle. And that is the stuff that under any particular policy regime will actually get deployed. So you have, under the current rules of the game, you would have the economic potential actually being deployed as an energy system today. And the role of policy in bioenergy is slightly different to the role of policy for energy generally, because when we look at this resource, the role of bioenergy policy has to be about maximising that overlap in the middle. It has to be about making the big sustainable potential equal to the economic potential. If we can access that big circle on the right at a sensible price, then we have maximised the resource that we can use sustainably, and that is the objective from a resource perspective. It's a bit early in the morning. I hope that makes sense because it really is quite important to think about maximising the resource. There were some graphs shown yesterday that showed, I can't remember which of the greenhouse gas ones it was, but it showed that you could get a certain greenhouse gas saving, but if you did that, you then only had a very limited resource. So it's important that we look at trying to maximise the resource at a sensible price, and that's the function of sensible policy regimes. So Where are we on policy? Well, we start at a very high level, and for a long time we've had a global framework in place focused on climate change. The UNFCCC framework looks at greenhouse gases globally, and it sets targets and limits that are put out on a country basis. So the signatories to the agreement all say that they're going to limit their greenhouse gas emissions to a certain percentage below the levels that were set in 1990. Now, for us, the signatory to that agreement is actually done at European level. So the EU sign up to this and sign up to a certain target. We then implement that country by country with different directives. And we've had a renewable energy sources directive that was really aimed at trying to do the greenhouse gases thing. So we've got the climate objective set at international level, and then when we come down to implementation, we try to achieve that climate objective by focusing on saying we'll have a renewable energy target. We've had a renewable fuels directive, and more recently we've had the fuel quality directive, which has been trying to make changes gradually as we've had new knowledge on the bioenergy, particularly on the sustainability and greenhouse gas side. So these things are coming down gradually, cascading. At national level, we then have renewable energy action plans, and people then implement things on a national level from there onwards. So for example, in the UK, we've had a renewables obligation now for, 2001, I think. So we've had the RO for a long time. We've had a renewable transport fuel obligation. We then revisited things. We went back and we did banding of the RO because some technologies, particularly bioenergy, wasn't being brought through under the original technology blind arrangement. And we've gone back now and we've talked about double counting different sources. We've got a renewable heat incentive because heat wasn't being brought through under the original arrangements. So we can go through and look at the policy regime at different levels, but I think it's important to remember that the chief driver up the top is the UNFCCC framework, and it's all about global greenhouse gases. So we disaggregate this with country targets, and then politicians will set targets that say things like we want a 20% share of renewables by 2020, but what we're actually aiming for is the greenhouse gases up the top, and it is important to remember that, because sometimes when we get down to the bottom, we can get obsessed with the target of 5% renewable transport fuel or whatever it is and forget what the point was at the start. So for me, the point is the GHGs. I mentioned that things in that previous slide at European level actually, that there have been a number of different pieces of legislation put in the last year or two. And really that's been to try and address what's been quite a fast moving landscape in the last 10 years in bioenergy. I'm sure that you're all aware of the different things that have apparently been discovered over the last 10 years or so. So we had the Searching Your case, which led to stuff on indirect land use change. In the UK, we paused at that point and we held the Gallagher review to look at whether or not we should have a moratorium on things. And what you find happening on the bioenergy space is people set off trying to do something in particular with the GHG target in mind. They put the energy quotas and objectives in place, pursue that, and then find as soon as they start doing that and they start delivering on the energy side, they realise that all these other things are happening as well. It gets reported in a scientific journal that actually, you know, this is massive because we've got these croplands issue and we've got indirect land use change. And that then gets circulated back, and we almost have had a situation where policy has been running to keep up with the science in the last 10 years or so, which is not usually a good place to be. So you've got a number of different areas of knowledge coming through, and trying to keep up and manage those has been quite hard. So we're constantly updating the policy instruments that were put in place some time ago to reflect the emerging knowledge that's gathering. And the result of that is some of these instruments have become incredibly complicated. And that, for me, hasn't happened in other sectors. We haven't seen that happening with photovoltaics. We haven't seen it happening with wind. It's been much simpler there. There have been banding, yes, around offshore, onshore, and there's been looks at different size ranges, and we've adapted to a technology curve whereby as things progress, we step back and say, should we really still be paying that technology so much? But there's no other sector, to my mind, that has had the challenges that bioenergy has had thrown at it in the last 10 years. The big one, I think, is uncertainty. And you see this happening a lot. You get one report in a journal, which is apparently being peer-reviewed. It comes through and it tells you that this system is really good because it does this in terms of greenhouse gas savings. It's fabulous. And 2 days later, you'll have a different report that's apparently looking at almost the same thing, giving you exactly the opposite answer. Now, we've had a long look at this in the SuperGem Bioenergy Hub. It's looking at greenhouse gas balances and different drivers of uncertainty. And it's important to realise that some of this you can actually deal with. There are variations in methodology, which really we shouldn't be comparing systems that have had their calculations done in different ways. We should be looking at this in a sensible, consistent way. You've got in the middle there variations in system boundaries. When people want to make a particular political point, they will often choose their system appropriately in order to show that it really does or doesn't save greenhouse gases. So you can play with the methodology, you can play with the scope and boundary, and those can result in wide divergence of the apparent figures that we should be trusting as, you know, the sort of global greenhouse gas indicators. But on top of that, for bioenergy, you also have this issue with variation in the input data, because you saw the pictures that many of you were looking at yesterday for supply chains. Everyone does it slightly differently. The performance of the machines is different, and trying to define a supply chain in a consistent way is really hard. You've got variability in yields, you've got a natural system, and you've got just a huge amount of uncertainty in the input data. And the bottom one there, I have data inaccuracy. One of the things that, again, you see happening in the carbon accounting side of things is certain numbers get recognised in the literature, and someone will quote them, and they then get perpetuated, and you end up with people doing calculations with numbers that were produced in a particular context 25 years ago and are now wildly out of date. But because they've come through and they always get quoted, it's always the same number, and they gain a credence. That means that, you know, willow yields is a classic one where people have got stuck on the same number for a very long period of time. Now, some of the work that Rebecca and others are doing in the UK with their mapping is trying to address that. But there's an awful lot of naivety about just using the easy number because this person used it in their last study and therefore it will be okay. That means that we're not getting an entirely realistic picture sometimes on the greenhouse gases. So, in summary, uncertainty is hard, really hard to deal with. That would be okay if it wasn't important. The problem is that it can be very important. But this is an example of the importance of uncertainty. So what I have here is a forest residues which are being pelleted, shipped to the UK and used in a UK power station. You see there are 4 different bands here, and these are different options. So on the left we've got the forest residues drying with biomass, then with the next section is forest residues drying with diesel, the next one is sawmill residues drying with biomass, and sawmill drying with diesel. For each of those, we've given you 5 different figures. The first figure is what you would get in terms of greenhouse gases if you didn't have any significant greenhouse gas emissions from the storage period when that wood is being stored. If you look at the storage in large piles of wood, there is again a paucity of data, and the few numbers that we do have in terms of the methane release potential of those are numbers that date again from a long time ago. So if I take those numbers from a long time ago and I say it's the best I've got, it's got to be right, let's plug it into the model and see what happens, what you get is this ramping up from left to right. And at the bottom there, things aren't too bad, but that black line across the top is coal-fired power generation. So what you can see is that if I take that number from the 80s, maybe this number being produced on these wood chip piles, and you plug it into a model, you will calculate that if I keep that there for 4 months, within 4 months, my biomass system is worse than a coal system. So uncertainty matters. It makes a real difference in the real world if I don't know exactly what that pile's doing. Now, There's an issue here with, a gap in scientific evidence, and we're addressing that. So Ian Shield and Carly are here, and Carly has been busy building wood chip piles. Nicola, right, has been building wood chip piles and measuring the methane releases from them. So we do need to look at where uncertainty can be really devastatingly important and identify that by looking at the whole system. But then we need to do something about it. We can't just say, oh dear, that's bad, we mustn't do bioenergy. You then need to look at that. And one of the things that Ian and Carly found last year was that they actually got quite big variations with some of the different piles that they were looking at. So therefore, we need to understand what's driving this. Is it really methane being released from the pile? What is the actual flux coming out of it? So there's work going on at the moment to try and address that. But it's just important to realise some numbers can have very big impacts, and when they do, we really need to sort them out. If I have uncertainty in my greenhouse gas calculations, a very obvious thing to me seems to be that the first thing you've got to do if you want to manage that uncertainty and you want to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions is that you need to actually count them. This seems to me a total and utter no-brainer. I cannot understand why you would try to put a policy system in place for bioenergy, which is really aimed at this top target of reducing global greenhouse gases, and then say, but actually we don't care what the greenhouse gas along the supply chain looks like. We're not going to count that. As long as it's a boiler and as long as it's this size and reaching this efficiency, you can just do it. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So you've got to count them, and then you get into issues with, well, what's the best sort of instrument to be looking at for that? And we had a lady over from the Helmholtz Institute who did some work in the UK with the hub last year, and she was looking at the role of different instruments, quantity instruments, so that's where you set a target and say we want to have 10% of our energy as renewable, or price-based instruments where you say that I want this particular type of energy and I'm prepared to pay this much for it. And what she did was an economic analysis that was a little bit beyond me, to be perfectly honest. She was very good. But she came to this conclusion by this comparison of German and UK systems that for bioenergy, what was actually essential was a hybrid analysis. That you need to have a hybrid instrument, and that would be the most efficient, i.e. the most cost-effective way of bringing bioenergy forward. System boundary and scope, I mentioned a bit at the start, it is possible to play games with this and to get very different answers. Life cycle assessment is a tool which you can use, but you've got to really understand what you're doing with it. It is just so important that you realise that life cycle assessment is designed to answer a particular question. You've got to scope the boundary of what you're looking at in a way that's consistent with what you're trying to work out. It's, it's the sort of thing we tell school children, that if you're setting up a maths problem, you've got to look at what you're trying to do in the real world and then set your mathematical calculation around it. But this gets lost a little bit in the policy world because we're trying to make things more uniform and we're trying to treat everything with a level playing field. But the reality is many of these systems don't actually work like that. You've got to look at a system and say, actually, I've gone down this route, I've seen this, and I think this came out a little bit in Andrew's presentation yesterday, where he showed that huge variability that you can get with different counterfactuals and other variations when we look at renewable heat. So you've got to be really clear at the outset what you are looking for, and you've got to scope the policy instrument around that. To date, that hasn't really happened. What we've done is we've said we've got a target, we've got an instrument, it works well for solar and it works well for wind, so we'll just put a little bit of supply chain accounting on the back and we'll deal with bioenergy in the same way. So we're not really trying to do something that is targeting the greenhouse gases in the way that we should be if we want to be managing this. This is a brand new one that was just published a month or so ago, but this shows a number of ways of counting greenhouse gases. So I said we've got to be clear about the question. In this paper, what I did was I took a number of different things you could do with biomass. So I took chemical production on the left, I put it through a boiler for domestic heating, I put it through a wood chip boiler, I did electricity, and I did biochar with it. We put through all these calculations and we said, now, what are the different ways that I might measure the utility of that biomass system if I have a greenhouse gas hat on? And we have, I think, in this paper, 6 or 7 different ways you would measure greenhouse gas utility. And what you find is that by framing that question very slightly differently each time, you need to adapt the methodology, adapt the scope, and the result is that you get a different rank ordering every time. So it's really quite worrying that we pick a single one to focus on that I frankly don't think reflects the idea of global greenhouse gas reductions, and within that we make decisions about which technology to bring forward. Okay, accounting for land. This is something else that photovoltaics and wind and things like that don't have to do. The reality is that the land base for biomass is a significant source of the supply chain emissions, and this just doesn't happen with other systems. In that, yes, you've done it for this field and this site, but you haven't yet done it for another site, and it could be completely different. So we've got these same issues of uncertainty because we're using land. We have another thing that we were discussing about multifunctionality, and we were talking about the fact that land produces the energy crop, but it can also be credited for pollution control and water treatment. So you don't have to recognise that multifunctionality if you're trying to do a combined cycle power station. So there are different things that it's worth recognising for bioenergy in a way that you just don't have to do elsewhere. The fact that we use land also brings us on to the massive issue of food-fuel interfaces, and Nilay showed us yesterday how he's dealing with that by trying to expand into a system that considers food and fuel alongside, and that's great, but I can now say this today because he's not here, which is that I'm working on that project too, and the constraint is that I think at the moment we've only got something like 4 or 5 different crops modelled in there. So it's really data intensive, it takes a really long time, and also you've got issues with the idea of food security being a single number. You know, the UK, yes, has a certain level of food security, but we actually also export lots of stuff and import lots of stuff. So, you know, it doesn't quite work to be just trying to say we want to keep enough land for us to provide our provision without thinking of the trade elements. And this is some work that we've been doing, looking at the sustainable level of land availability for different biomass resources. Shows that the interfaces with other systems are key. So this is the sustainable UK biomass resource going from 2015 through to 2050 under different future scenarios where you incentivise food, where you have big increases in trade and have an economic focus, where you have a conservation focus with more protected land, and where you actually go all out and say, hey, we want to use loads of stuff for energy. And what you can see is it makes an absolutely massive difference to what we're calling sustainable. And I come back to those little circles at the beginning, that the aim of the game here is to maximise the overlap in the middle. That would be easy if you were using your driver as energy, but when you see here that the key driver that makes a difference from left to right is actually all these other systems around it. It's the food system, it's the land system, it's what's happening in the wider economy. Then you realise that actually this is really hard, that just incentivising the energy end of it is unlikely to be enough. There are different drivers, and this again, you know, shows a whole mapping of different drivers that can be used to increase the biomass resource, and some are more significant than others. If you want to actually increase something, I said at the start, if you want to maximise the greenhouse gas reductions, it's a good idea to measure them, first of all. But you need to be actually able to reach those variables and drivers rather than just reaching the end product, the energy. And the importance of the counterfactuals. And the challenge with this is you can't legislate for what somebody would have done if they didn't do the thing that you've encouraged them to do. So having a really sensible perspective on this is key. But I think we also have to realise the limitations of energy policy, that energy policy is about doing energy, and actually bioenergy has a whole host of these other things attached to it that energy policy is frankly never going to make a difference to. Yet they're important, yet they drive the resource, the sustainability and the greenhouse gas emissions. The thorny issue of the temporal aspects, again, something that is relevant for some of the other technologies but doesn't get highlighted in the same way. The logic we have at the moment is that we're rapidly running out of time from a greenhouse gases perspective to sort out the problem that we as a society have created, because we only have a certain amount of headroom left in the emission space in the atmosphere. We know that cumulative emissions means that what we're emitting now stays up there for a very long time, and the Climate Change Committee set budgets as a result. The tricky thing with biomass is that we sequester from the atmosphere and we re-release. And we do this on a certain time scale. Now, if I'm dealing with a crop which is annual, then I've got a very fast cycle on that carbon. And you can reasonably assume that there isn't a long-term change in the atmospheric burden if I'm recycling quickly on a year-to-year basis. If I've got something that has lasted a little bit longer, like an SRC plantation where I've harvested every 3 years, then that argument sort of still runs. It begins to break down when I look at stuff that has been established for a long time, and this is part of the issue with forest material and the utilisation of it, that you've got to think about what is an appropriate time period to actually be taken into account in these calculations. And if we were dealing with a situation where we'd realised we had a problem at the start of the Industrial Revolution, and we knew we had a space to control and we were only interested in the long term, then this would be nowhere near as big an issue. But because we're so up against it in terms of having very little headroom left and very little time left, the timing of these emissions does make a difference. Now, there's a positive side to this, because when I look at, let's say, a PV panel that's manufactured in China tomorrow, what actually happens is there's a whole load of carbon released in the manufacturing stage, and then you save later. So the carbon debt argument is exactly the same for other renewables as it can be portrayed sometimes for a bioenergy system. The potential advantage for bioenergy is that if we can sequester now, then that actually makes a difference, because the logic of cumulative emissions is that near-term carbon reductions are more valuable in terms of keeping the planet in the right place than longer-term ones are. So it's of much more use to me to be able to save or extract a unit of carbon today than it is to do that next year. So if you can have additional growth and you can have additional sequestration now, that does actually make a difference, and it's important to recognise that. But yeah, the other complexity with biomass, so many system options, and we had a little bit of this yesterday with the harvesting and so on. I've put the technical options down the bottom on here. With a system that is so diverse, it's really hard to have a policy instrument that can tackle all of those at once and actually improve the sustainability across the board. The importance of the supply chain. This was some work I did for Government Office for Science in the UK a few years ago, trying to explain the importance of resource efficiency for bioenergy. And what you see here is a difference between a first generation and a second generation feedstock. And the key thing that drives the fact that we've got the same unit of land on the left, but one has massively more fuel produced per unit area of land than the other. And the point we were trying to make in this is that comparing conversion efficiencies and comparing yields and stuff like that is part of the story, but it's the cumulative impact down the chain that actually makes that massive difference at the end. And the biggest one is this convertible portion of biomass in the middle. The beauty of the second generation material is not that you get a higher yield, it's that you can use all of it, and you can use it in multiple different ways. Energy policy is good for driving energy. Greenhouse gas policy is good for driving greenhouse gases. If what you actually have with bioenergy is impacts that range across what you see there on the ecological, social and economic, you really will be scrambling around for a policy instrument that's going to target and improve all of those at once. It's a huge, huge challenge. This is one of my favourite graphs. The blue circle is doing mineral oil, and I'm measuring the performance of mineral oil against 36 different social, economic and ecologic parameters. It's an ecological risk framework, but put simply, if I'm being more sustainable, then I'm stretching that blue circle. If I start doing biodiesel from soy in Argentina, I get the purple blob. And there's some things it's good for, and then there's a whole host of things it's not good for. And bioenergy is complicated because some people would say, we must never do this because on that particular parameter it has fallen below the threshold. And it's easy to put thresholds in legislation and say you've got to meet this minimum greenhouse gas saving. And if you do that, you might be missing all those other 6 benefits that you have on the outside. So I personally find arbitrary thresholds in legislation where you've got to meet minimum criteria are really not very helpful in a framework where I've got loads of uncertainty, so I don't really know where I am, and I've got these multiple objectives. What we've been doing for 20 years is we've been trying to use energy policy to crack something that's about an awful lot more than just energy. The multifunctionality and these other dimensions are things that actually the rest of the energy technologies don't have to deal with. So the instruments that you need to use need to actually reflect the scope of the objectives. What we've done to date is we've taken instruments that already existed and we've tweaked them and we've changed them every time we see something we don't like. I think we need to actually stand back and say, remind me here, what am I trying to get to? It's this global greenhouse gases thing, and start with a framework that goes from there. I was in Berlin earlier this week at a meeting that was focused on international bioenergy and sustainability, and I got very cross when they tried to put a statement out at the end of the day that said that bioenergy was good because it was going to, quote, let countries meet their emission targets. So I put my hand up and said, I don't care if countries meet their emission targets or not. Because individual countries can argue, oh, it's okay, we met our target and you didn't. All that matters is if globally we're actually getting a net reduction. And it isn't, you know, the trade in bioenergy is a key issue here, but we need to recognise the totality of that instead of trying to segregate things country by country. So you need instruments that will effectively act as drivers of the things you actually want to do. So if your top priority, as it was in Berlin, was about enabling poor people to access energy, then the driver needs to focus on that and not to look at the greenhouse gas element of it, because the greenhouse gases will go up if you give more people access, because you've got a new energy system on the cards. You need flexibility, you need to be able to adapt these instruments, and you need to be able to recognise that science will move and we will make new discoveries and we will find out new stuff, and you've got to be able to adapt the instrument to recognise that. So I don't have a rubber stamped answer on what this should look like. It's challenging, but the prize is huge because you have an energy system here which can deliver against my big objective of reducing global greenhouse gases. I know this because we do an awful lot of number crunching on this in Tyndall, and you can make impacts in all these areas as well. Who wouldn't want that? But getting it right in terms of trying to drag all of that into an energy policy framework is really very hard. And that's where I'm going to end. Thank you.
I would like to come back to your initial slide saying that we should include external effects in the economy.
Yeah.
And how would you go about that given all the uncertainties on the life cycle impacts, etc.?
If I knew that, would I be standing here? You know, let's go back to that initial slide. So from a bioenergy perspective, if I'm looking at the external costs, then I guess what we have at the moment, and it does concern me a little bit, this is, let's particularly take the case of the UK. Drax were here yesterday. Drax import a lot of biomass from overseas. That, from a UK perspective, allows us to meet our so-called targets. You know, we do okay on the renewables targets, and for a greenhouse gas perspective, we actually take the hit under the UNFCCC framework for everything that is released in the UK. So we do that. The sequestration benefit is realised under the LULUCF accounting in the country from which we import the material. But if I look at it from that perspective and I look at the external costs, how would you rationalise that? You know, in the UK we're releasing it, and therefore we're saying that we're charged with meeting a target. We choose to do that by importing. Therefore, on bioenergy, we're saying, yes, you've got to bear the cost of that because the accounting rules say that you should take that in your own country. But if we import plastic goods from China, we don't bear the cost of that in our own country. So we have a tradable commodity here where we're treating two different commodities, you know, quite differently. If I bring sugar over or oil over instead of wood, I don't do that. So I think part of the problem is that people have tried to address this number one bullet point by putting in place a supply chain accounting system, but trying to superimpose that on top of the territorial-based thing that we already have doesn't work. I think you've got to either do one or the other. You've got to either stick absolutely to territorial, make every country, and by that I mean countries that also currently don't have reduction targets, make every country commit to some level of reduction, and then that would allow you at least to be accounting for things correctly, and might stop some of the practices whereby we basically don't bother reducing our demand because we import stuff that we're calling carbon neutral instead. So I think that the supply chain accounting was a stopgap when we realised there was a big problem. And what we actually need to do is, if you're going to do supply chain accounting, do it for the whole thing, you know, make it every import and every trade commodity has to do it. But the reality is I don't think that would be feasible. I think we need to have reductions on a territorial basis, but we need to make the producer countries that we're currently importing from have targets as well, hard though that may be when you're looking at developing nations and so on.
When we were summarizing, synthesizing the scope report, there was an underlying discussion that I identified, which was what was more important? Was it proposing, promoting bioenergy for greenhouse gas emissions, or was it promoting it for sustainable development? And this came up as several authors moving up the paragraph on sustainable development, then the others would move up the GHG emissions paragraph up to the introduction, and then it occurs that where bioenergy started being used in scale, it was never for GHG emissions. It was originally for energy security and development. Many countries, small or big, they were using because they did not want to rely or could not rely on oil. And aren't we pushing through this because at this point we really need to decrease emissions, and forgetting that for many countries they just don't care about emissions?
I think you're right. I think we also had this discussion in Berlin. I left before they finalised the document, but it was interesting because I said that there was one thing that I moaned about as soon as I saw the preliminary statement in Berlin, and I've commented on that already, but the other thing that I shouted about was they wanted this bullet point statement in that said that as we progress towards 1 millennium development goal, we must not sacrifice any of the others. And I said, no, you can't do that, because this is a live system with multiple impacts. And if you change something that changes one of those objectives and your performance against one of those, then everything else will change. You know, you cannot say that everything else will be completely static. And that is the case, I think, yes, with the greenhouse gas objective and the energy security objective and a whole number of others. But yeah, you're right. The reality is there are a whole load of people for whom this is not a greenhouse gas issue. I think, you know, my perspective, climate change centre, all that sort of thing, if I'm doing something that makes the greenhouse gas situation worse, then I guess I can't countenance that, in the sense that we've got so little time left. It is so much, you know, a threat to everything else. So yeah, okay, you might say that we're doing this for energy security and we're doing it for empowerment and we're improving biodiversity. But the reality is that if we do something that causes a global increase in greenhouse gases, we could end up in a tipping point situation that will actually come full circle and will impact on all those other things as well that we're trying to preserve. So say we're trying to look at, you know, energy security, we will inadvertently affect energy security if we go to a higher level of warming that actually then threatens by having more frequent flooding and other things. So people, in trying to preserve that access at the moment and the energy security, you do run the risk that by doing the greenhouse gases thing, it will all come full circle again. So I guess that's the only sensible response I have to that. But yeah, it's hard, different perspectives, and as you know, this is why these things take so long to negotiate at international level.